The paper that we wrote, there, and I mean, we've talked about the topic a few times, including once actually in this room, I think, about a year ago. So, on the one hand, we don't want to just repeat everything. On the other hand, we had to figure out how we're going to do it.
It gets better, actually. We the first couple times we didn't even know what we thought completely, and it's evolving as we present it, and every time we add more fun stuff, and so you get the best one yet.
So conventionally, the way we do it is I put images up, and I talk about the dead people, and when you see a living person, that's when you're...
Oh, that's my cue.
That's when Well, we could do it the other way around today, if you want, but...
I don't think we're quite up to there. Yeah, okay. I mean, we dream of the time that I can present the archaeology and he can present the anthropology. I think he's up to it, but you know, math is hard. I can't quite do the archaeology yet.
Well, we did start with archaeology, and we started with the idea that there was something fundamentally wrong with the way that archaeologists and anthropologists were not really talking to each other about the earliest known human political systems. And then we immediately sort of get into trouble, because what do we mean by earliest known? Do we mean the earliest documented, or do we mean the earliest that can be known by various proxies, as is often the way with people who write about the very earliest hominin social systems, where of course these things can't be reconstructed in any absolutely direct way, so one has to rely on comparisons with other primates or with other living human groups. But actually the problem we started with, if I remember correctly, was this much more specific thing, which is what Colin Renfrew calls the sapient paradox, which just relates to a particular moment, or, you know, the prehistorian's moment lasts about 50,000 years, so a prehistoric sort of moment, and a particular problem in what archaeologists would call the upper Paleolithic. So the basic paradox that you start with is that genetically and biologically it's roughly thought that we've been roughly as we are for about 200,000 years or so. But when you actually look at the archaeological record, there appears to be this lack of synchrony, if you like, between the ticking of these two clocks, the genetic clock on the one hand and the cultural clock on the other, because it's only at about 100,000 years ago on the southern tip of Africa that you begin to see direct evidence for what you might call normal human behavior. In other words, incredibly weird stuff like painting your body and creating designs that appear to have no utilitarian purpose whatsoever but are in some way symbolic. So typically human. And it's very isolated sort of evidence. And then there's rather a large gap. And then it's only really at about 50,000 years ago that you begin to see any kind of real sort of density of evidence for what prehistorians call modern behavior, which is the same kind of symbolic expression and all kinds of new sophisticated ways of making tools, transforming materials, bone, clay, and fibers and so on, clothing, ornamenting the body, and also what has been interpreted by archaeologists as the earliest evidence for institutional social inequality. That's part of that package of things that appear in the archaeological record with that sort of frequency only at around 50,000 years ago. So the paradox, as Renfrew puts it, is that it's why...
Yeah, we started looking and having brains more or less like we did quite some time ago, and then for a long time we all sat around sort of looking like all the people in this room but not acting like them.
Precisely.
Yeah, and then suddenly they did.
And suddenly they did. So why? And there are two answers out there in the literature, broadly speaking. One of them is that there is a very late mutation in the human brain, which coincides with this sort of thing at around 50,000 years ago. personally, I don't find that very convincing.
Since there's no evidence whatsoever.
Right,
yeah.
there's no evidence for it.
Yeah.
It also wouldn't explain very well why so much of the evidence for this kind of behavior is concentrated in a particular part of the world, which is now part of Europe and the Mediterranean. How can you have a localized mental mutation which then spreads to the whole species?
Right. Not to mention it starts in Africa and then it stops for a while, then it starts again somewhere else. So how's that a mutation, right?
So we don't really buy that. There's another kind of explanation which was developed partially at UCL by my colleague Stephen Shannon, which is about population densities, and it argues that when populations of hunter-gatherers passed a certain threshold of density, the rates of transmitting culture became incremental, so that innovations of one sort or another would simply be passed on with greater and greater frequency, so that they sort of stick and become permanent features of human societies. That seems to have some advantages. It would explain quite well why it is in this sort of area that you see evidence for those kind of stereotypically modern behaviors, because Europe at the time is obviously, at the time, what do we mean by the time? Let's say at the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago, Europe of course is on the edge of a huge glacier, and then the shaded bits on our map, these are what geographers call refugia, little or reasonably small pockets of inhabitable land sandwiched between the forests around the coasts and the glacial regions to the north. So really this kind of steppe tundra parkland where all kinds of living species, not just humans but all the animals and plants that they use, become concentrated. It's in those kind of settings really that the whole drama is played out. Part of the question is who are the actors? Are they these sort of Rousseau-like little bands of hunter-gatherers with very egalitarian sort of social structures, or are they something quite different? And one of the things that struck us, right, was just the sheer ambivalence of people who write on this topic.
Yeah.
We could give you a quote, for example, by a primatologist and sociobiologist, Christopher Böhm, who wrote Hierarchy in the Forest. And, you know, he makes a point that personally I would agree with, which is that we don't have to have this endless debate between Hobbes and Rousseau. Were we originally hierarchical? Were we originally egalitarian? It's a false dichotomy, he says. What makes us human is that we're much more complex than that. We have all these clever strategies for resisting domination. We can ridicule people, we can censure them, we can ostracize them, and we can come up with clever sorts of institutions for limiting the exercise of power. But then he goes on and does this. Do you want to be Böhm?
Oh, I will be Böhm.
Yeah. Then he does this.
At that time, people were beginning to live increasingly in chiefdoms.
He's German.
I'm not going to do German. I could do no. All right. At that time, people were beginning to live increasingly in chiefdoms.
That's 5,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Because he makes a major assumption.
Oh, that's not 5,000 years, you mean?
Yeah, no, it's 5,000.
Really?
That's his assumption. That's a direct quote.
Yes. The major assumption that humans were egalitarian for thousands of generations before hierarchical societies began to appear, which he places around 5,000 years ago. At that time, people were beginning to live increasingly in chiefdoms, societies of highly privileged individuals who occupied hereditary positions of power. From certain well-developed chiefdoms came the 6 early civilizations, with their powerful and often despotic leaders. But before 12,000 years ago, humans basically were egalitarian. They lived in what might be called societies of equals, with minimal political centralization and no social classes. Everyone participated in group decisions, and outside the family, there were no dominators.
Right, which raises an obvious question, right?
What is that question, David?
The question is, if our species has this ingrained capacity for political complexity, why did we leave it on the shelf for most of our history? Why would you postulate that for most of human history, human societies were basically egalitarian? When you've just made the argument that
they don't have to be.
They don't have to be. So this raises a problem. It also raises a particular problem for archaeologists who've been arguing for quite a while that there is very clear evidence for something like ranked societies or hierarchical societies right back to the late Pleistocene. So I think one of the things that we started off thinking was, why do we have to choose, right, between these very stark alternatives? Right,
and the way they do it is, like, either you're just totally simple, you have no social structure, basically, you live in tiny bands, and simplicity means equality, or you're complex. And if you're complex, well, then somebody's running the show and people are pushing each other around. And these are assumed to be the same. Complexity necessarily means hierarchy.
Yeah.
Social hierarchy. Yeah.
And then we read Robert Lowy.
We did.
And that was important.
That was important because we discovered that essentially the literature on hunter-gatherers kind of changed in mid-20th century. That in the early part of the 20th century, one of the founding works was Marcel Mauss's work on the Eskimo, but he called it Seasonal Variations of the Eskimo, which was all about how social structures go back and forth between highly simple, dispersed forms during certain seasons of the year. And then in the case of the Inuit, there's one season where they're mostly hunting caribou, they're land animals. They go off in these little family groups. And the family groups are actually very hierarchically organized or patriarchal. They have private property. There's a head honcho in charge of every one. And then in other seasons, they gather together on the coasts for seal hunting under the aegis of Sedna, goddess of the seals, and everything completely changes. That's when they have the big igloos, but they're communal with multi-families living together. They have giant wife-swapping orgies. They share property. Everything is completely different. The way food is distributed is different. So you have two different social structures, essentially, which seem to imply completely different ideas of what society or life is all about that are operative at different times of year. And that was the old model.
Right.
Yeah.
So we started sort of doing two things simultaneously in terms of research, I think. I started educating myself about the Stone Age because I normally work on much later periods, but I'm very lucky and I have lots of nice colleagues next door who could tell me what to read. And you started sort of excavating the history
of
this
happened?
whole...
Because it's fascinating. There's a progression of thought that certain ideas get kept and certain ones get lost in the tradition of anthropological thinking about seasonality, especially. So you have Mauss's work, and then Durkheim, Mauss's uncle, gets interested in this stuff. Mauss puts him onto the literature about Australia, and this is how the elementary forms of the religious life eventually happens. But Durkheim takes it up in a certain way. He says, well, you have these people, they're dispersed in little bands, but during that time they're really just interested in subsistence. It's just practical utilitarian stuff. And then when they get together, that's the ritual season. That's where society appears to us, where you have this collective effervescence, so that essentially the gods are born because when you all gather together and have rituals, this thing which is social structure seems to appear from outside you, and you don't understand how, so you see it as gods. So the season where hunter-gatherers gather together is seen as this ritual time of social creation where social structure exists, and otherwise, people are mainly just feeding themselves. It's curious because it's not really what Mauss tried to sort of make his work do that, but it isn't really what was going on in the Inuit material in a certain way. In the Inuit material, you actually do have a fairly strong social structure, these patriarchal bands, in the season where everybody's dispersed. But when they gather together, they kind of subvert all this, and they have these giant orgies and crazy carnivalesque rituals of different kinds, and people put on play different parts. Very similar in the Northwest Coast. A lot of those people have different names in different seasons. So in the ritual season, when everybody gathers together, you're actually called something different than you are during the summer season. And in those cases, actually things almost like states seem to emerge, or state power, but only in the ritual, where everybody puts on these ceremonies, and there's actually police that are only operative while you're putting on a ritual.
It even works for bureaucracy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because we found this little footnote somewhere in Moss that the Inuit used to actually mark their property, but only on a seasonal basis.
Right.
So, you can see where we're going already.
So there's two totally different social structures in different times of year. And in some of those times of year, people are playing around with things that look a lot like what these guys would call more complex and therefore hierarchical social structures. But it could be either in the the dispersed season or the concentrated season. Now, so Durkheim takes up the ritual gathering together aspect of it. Robert Lowy, who's now largely forgotten, a originally German Boasian anthropologist, worked in California, right? He ended up, was he at Berkeley?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I met that guy who was taught by him and did the impression of the walrus.
That's right. Apparently he looked just like a walrus. And
when he was teaching, when he was teaching the Eskimo, he used to, because he had this Austrian accent, nobody could understand anything he said. But apparently he used to teach something about Inuit hunting, and then he would lie prostrate on the desk, and he had this. I've got a picture of him somewhere. He looks exactly like one.
Yeah. Pretending to be a walrus. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's the guy. He's the guy. How do you make it big? Slide from current. Slide. He's the guy on the bottom left, and he used to lie prostrate on the desk and say, "Und as you can see, I am not a walrus."
Yeah.
Okay.
Lowy studied Native American sides of the plains. Lakota, was it? Or Oglala, maybe? But he wrote this amazing essay that nobody reads anymore. What was it called? I discovered
it's called
this.
American Aborigines or something.
Political
life among American Aborigines. So apparently he referred to Americans as Aborigines at that time.
That's right. You could still do that.
So this is
20s, I think.
20s,
yeah. And this article has been completely forgotten, but it's actually incredibly influential because essentially he made the entire argument that Pierre Clastres was later to make famous as Society Against the State. But he actually had elements in there that Clastres left out. So I don't know if anybody's read Pierre Clastres. Pierre Clastres was the sort of anthropological guru of Deleuze and Guattari. He was kicked out of Lévi-Strauss's circle for being an anarchist. He came up with this notion is a sort of anti-evolutionary notion because even back in the 60s, French anthropology was still caught up in still something of an evolutionary paradigm. And he pointed out that even in English language anthropology, there's still a tacit evolutionism. People will do assume that complexity and hierarchy are the same thing. So even the structural functionalist anthropologists, these people who are supposedly great relativists, would say things like, this society has not yet reached the level of the great kingdoms. Or there's this assumption that, in order to organize things, you got to push people around. And what Clastres pointed out is that there's this tacit idea that you're slowly figuring out more complex forms of organization, and yes, violence and oppression comes with that, but that's just part of the deal. Whereas he said, if you look at what Amazonian societies are the ones he particularly was working on, you look at Amazonian societies, it's not as if they don't understand what it means to push people around and give people orders. They've all heard of kingdoms and states. They just really, really dislike the idea. So, the better way to think of it is to think of what he called society against the state, that these are societies that they haven't not figured out yet how to create a complex hierarchical society. They know exactly what it would be like, and they're organizing their entire lives to ensure that that never happens. This idea actually really comes out of Lowy, because if you look at Lowy's article and Kloster's original article, Society Against the State, it's pretty much the same thing, except he substitutes South American examples. Lowy points out that chiefs in North American societies there's no possible way that hierarchy can emerge, or that states certainly can emerge from within the existing political organizations, because political organizations are organized in such a way as to make sure that chiefs will never actually get the power to push anybody else around. And he goes through the different functions of the chief. It occurs exactly the same in Klostra. That chiefs are there to mediate with outsiders. They're there to inspire people through their actions. They're there to make beautiful speeches. There's all these famous stories about the incredible eloquence of Native American chiefs that, even the American soldiers that were sent in to exterminate them would be reduced to tears listening to them making speeches about making their case. And they do it anyway, but they feel really bad about it. And these are guys not even speaking their own language, they could still reduce you to tears. And, why were they so persuasive? Well, because they had no coercive power whatsoever. These guys, their only power was based on being really convincing. So they got very, very good at it. So Lowy elaborated all of this, but then he made one interesting point. Oh, and the other point that he makes that Kloster also makes is that, so therefore, since there's no possible way that political hierarchy could emerge from within the political system, which is designed essentially to find those people who would be leadership types and put them in this little trap where they're never going to actually be able to be leaders, so that if you're the chief, you have to work 5 times as hard as everybody else and give all your stuff away and be poorer than everyone, so forth and so on. He said it's not going to come out of that. It's got to come from prophets. This was Lowy's idea originally, or some kind of religious revival movement, millenary. The state has to come from some kind of millenarianism. So this was Lowy's idea as well. But Lowy adds something else which is very interesting, and which solves the problem that a lot of people have with Kloster, because they're saying, well, okay, maybe Amazonians in the period we know of have heard of the Incas, but what about before that? How people are living in these egalitarian societies for thousands of years, often with no idea of what a state would be like. So how are they organizing their entire lives around avoiding something that they've never experienced or even heard of? How does that make sense? Well, Lowy actually had an answer to this. He said, these societies are, as in the case of the Moses Inuit or Northwest Coast societies, are organized seasonally so that they actually create hierarchical institutions during certain types of year. So basically they're playing around with things that look sort of like a state and often operate sort of like a state, but only for a little period of time. So most of the Plains societies, they had about 2 or 3 months where society was organized completely differently than it was during the rest of the year. People would get together, there'd be it was the ritual season, but it was also the hunt season.
Right?
Late summer, yeah. It's essentially when the big buffalo herds came up, so they were organizing these mass hunts. So during those periods, they would actually take, sometimes one clan would rotate which one every year, or sometimes certain warrior societies. And those people would essentially be given absolute coercive power. They'd become police, basically. They could enforce decisions, they could coordinate, they would tell people when the hunt has to start and when you can't hunt yet, and they were allowed to punish people and whip people and burn down their teepees and take their stuff if they broke the rules. And they had absolute coercive power, much like cops. No one could do anything about it, and they worked with the chiefs. They decided when the ritual started. But then during the rest of the year, they were just like anybody else. So then everybody would disperse when the big Sundance ritual was over. People would go back to living in small bands. They would mediate all their problems through consensus. All decisions would be made communally. So you'd have 3 months where you're living in something that kind of resembles a state, but the rest of the year you're doing exactly the opposite.
And then something goes strange around the 1960s in the Man the Hunter Symposium, because this kind of institutional plasticity, where groups can shift their moral arrangements, their legal arrangements, their political arrangements on a seasonal basis, seems to have been taken quite for granted by most of the people who are describing hunter-gatherers up until the 1960s, when we get the beginnings of...
It already drops out in claustra. This is the one part of Lowy's article that he doesn't include, and part of the reason for that is because Amazonians, it's when they're dispersed that they're really hierarchical. So it's kind of confusing. You know, they have this trekking system where, like, they form these little patriarchal bands, and they go off and do hunter-gathering, and then they come back into the agricultural season, and they're relatively consensus-based again. So it kind of so it's the opposite of what Lowy was saying, and Clauster didn't seem to know quite what to do with it. So he just never talks about seasonality at all.
No. Now follows a short excursus on physical deformity.
Oh, shall we go there already? How much time do
we could do. I mean, these things are very important for archaeology because archaeologists, by and large, worked with the kind of evolutionary schemes that were being provided at the time by ethnographic fieldwork. But of course, you know, if you accept the idea that a society can morph on a seasonal basis between such radically different kinds of social and political arrangements as David's just been describing, then how can you actually have a scheme like band, tribe, chiefdom, state when, you know, the same population, exactly the same people, can actually take on defining attributes of all these different categories at different times of year, but they're still the same people. And by the same token, we felt this sets up a major problem for the kind of more recent attempts you have to distinguish, let's say, complex hunter-gatherers from simple hunter-gatherers. So if we look at some of the evidence, you know, getting back to the archaeology, now the dead people. Yeah, I mean, so this is the kind of thing that archaeologists worry about. So this is one of the adult burials at a place called Sungir in Russia, and it is absolutely suffused with body ornamentation. Somebody called Randall White in New York actually calculated how many human hours of labor it would have taken to create all these mammoth
beads, right?
Mammoth tusk beads and fox canine beads and that sort of thing. And it's some, you know, horrific amount of time and labor goes into this sort of thing. And then at the same site you've got it's not working now. You've got burials of young juvenile sort of teenagers, I suppose, back to back with these extraordinary lances of mammoth tusk, and again completely suffused with body ornamentation. There are other examples. These are all roughly from the period around the last glacial maximum, between about 30,000, 20,000 years ago. This is the guy they call Il Principe from Liguria, which is now sort of somewhere on the Spanish-Italian border, and he again has all these fantastic accoutrements, these special sort of tools and scepters and so on. This is the so-called Lady of Saint-Germain-la-Rivière, who's a bit younger. She's only about 15,000 years old, and she has all of these amazing ornaments around her body, her torso, which you see, archaeologists are so much cleverer now than they were in the 1950s, and they can use these methods of isotopic analysis and so on, in this case to establish that these ornaments are made on the teeth of deer that were hunted hundreds of kilometers away in the Spanish Basque country. So we've really got evidence here for a sort of superabundance of wealth, including exotic wealth, concentrated on particular ritual occasions. And then there are things like this, getting even more recent. This has been a source of enormous anxiety for about 30 years now. This is the Haran Plain, which is today, unfortunately, one of the largest refugee camps in the world, because it's on the Syrian-Turkish border. But before the war, there were hopes that this would become a major tourist destination because of these discoveries here at this place called Göbekli Tepe by a German archaeologist called Klaus Schmidt. And what you're looking at are what he would call temples, which date to about 9000 BC. In archaeological speak, that's already the Neolithic period, but actually there is no evidence anywhere on the site to suggest that the people who built these things were farming anything. All the evidence suggests that these were hunter-foragers, but as you can see, they did exactly the sort of thing that your conventional social evolutionary schema tells you they're not supposed to be doing. They create monumental stone architecture with these extraordinary
How big are these things?
carvings. These things are about 3 meters tall. They're absolutely enormous.
Okay.
And they imply presumably some kind of highly centralized way of organizing labor. They imply a lot of coordination, design and planning, and they are a bit of a mystery and a bit of a paradox.
Because the people who built them were dispersed in bands during much of the year.
Right.
Right.
So you can see where we're sort of going with all this, but we start out by looking at what people have already said about them, and what people have already said about these things is, no, they weren't egalitarian, they were terribly hierarchical, and lived in sort of hierarchical ranked societies. One of the things that struck us about this was, and then there are, monumental architecture and hunter-gatherers. It's not just Göbekli Tepe. If you go back another 10,000 years or so, and back into areas like, actually the whole kind of zone from what today is Krakow in Poland down to Kiev in Ukraine, around the last glacial maximum down to about 15,000 BC, you have these amazing monumental constructions, what the prehistorian Olga Sofer calls the Paleolithic's equivalent of public monumental works, which are made on mammoth bone, and they're really quite vast and impressive constructions. So it's not just Göbekli Tepe. One sort of sideline which just struck us as quite remarkable is that a clearly non-random proportion of those rich hunter-gatherer burials have very weird anatomies.
Oh, yes.
And this seems to be sort of a bit sidelined by the people who want to write about them as
because they want
to ranked sort of individuals.
Right, because these are supposedly the complex societies which show that hierarchy had already emerged 40, 50,000 years ago. And so they say, look at these incredible rich graves. They have like a huge amount of labor made in these incredible robes. They must have been like lords and kings. But then if you look at them, just about every one, they're either like giants or dwarves or hunchbacks.
It's quite extraordinary, and you start to think, and there is a guy who's done a proper sort of statistic. We're not making this up. He's done a proper statistical analysis, and it's some crazy percentage of these burials have the kind of deformities that would make you stand out in your social group very, very obviously. You're very tall, you're very short. You walk like
these are people who would even be tall now, let alone that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you start to wonder if the few that don't have physical deformities had some kind of other experience.
Right, if they were albinos, how would we know? Right,
yeah. Or just very clever or something. Something that doesn't show up in the skeletal evidence.
One eye's blue and one eye's green.
Yeah. And then David pointed out that it was inherently unlikely that the Paleolithic gave rise to a stratified elite that comprised purely giants, dwarfs and hunchbacks.
Maybe Tolkien was right.
Yeah, so there must be a better explanation. We don't know what it is, but it just seems inherently unlikely that what this represents is the emergence of the world's first sort of stratified elite.
Yeah,
There's
something else is going on.
More realistic going on.
Well, you had a hypothesis about this, didn't you?
Oh yeah, it's the Flintstones sort of thing. Because you can see this one, they dropped a huge rock on top of the burial. So the burial is done and covered with all its wonderful ornamentation, and then crushed under this enormous rock. And the real expert on this stuff is a guy called Paul Pettit, who I can't remember where he works now, but it's somewhere in the UK. And he's pointed out that actually another thing which a lot of these burials have in common is that the body has been in some way contained or bound or trapped or crushed. So, I guess you have to, if you want to stick to the evidence a bit more, you have to start thinking of ways in which what appears to be aggrandizement might actually be something rather different.
Especially because most people are not buried at all.
Exactly.
Yeah,
the whole idea of
yeah.
burying somebody, let alone burying them in clothes, seems to be what's weird about these people, because the vast majority of people in the Upper Paleolithic don't seem to have been buried anywhere at all. The normal behavior would be that their bodies are curated, broken up, fragmented, recycled in various ways. People make objects out of them. In general, people seem to be much more comfortable around human remains in circulation than we would be. So basically we think these burials, even at the time, would have been considered exceptional and weird, and that they can't simply be taken in, as a straightforward kind of proxy for social structure or something as simple as that.
Yeah, they seem to have been treated very well in life. They have the nutrition seems to be the same as everybody else. They lived normal lives, but then when they died, it was like, whoa, just get this out of the way. Put it someplace where they can't get us.
Right. So we thought we had to deal with that, right? Because it is one of, aside from monumental buildings, it is one of the key kind of forms of evidence on which prehistorians have pegged their claim that Paleolithic societies were ranked as opposed to egalitarian.
Right. So whatever is going on, it's not that.
It's not.
And it does open up some interesting questions, as an aside, about the role of sort of anomalous individuals in later formations of hierarchical structures. For example, in researching all this, we discovered that apparently there is no place in the world, not in the Americas, Aztecs, Mayas, China, India, where royal courts did not have dwarfs.
Someone's actually written a book on this.
Yeah, someone's researched it. Like, there's always, if there's a dwarf, they send him to the king. This always seems to happen. There's always royal dwarfs, and there's similar things like that. If you look at you were saying some of the earliest Egyptian royal courts. Yeah, they're all physically weird.
Yeah, that's another sort of paper in a way, but it's true. The burials of people who were actually, it seems, ritually killed in order to be buried around the earliest Egyptian kings, a number of them have these very striking physical deformities. I've actually seen the bones at this place called el-Kab in the south of Egypt, and they're either extraordinarily tall or extraordinarily short. It's quite odd, but that's an argument about the origins of the state.
Right. But insofar as there is something, sort of presaging the development of social inequality, you can see something going on here, because there's a tendency for chiefs to anomalous people, either because they're orphans or weirdos or crazy or runaways from wherever they come from, to sort of accumulate, which includes physically odd people, around chiefs and eventually become the basis of this sort of extra social power, which later turns into something more like a chief or state. But at this point, that's clearly not what's going on yet.
No, and that's something that we're still sort of working on and thinking about. But where we got to with this is that, well, if it doesn't represent the emergence of some kind of stratified elite, what is it? What is it all about? It does take us back to this problem of the sapient paradox, because whatever it does represent, it definitely represents some kind of marked ramping up. Some people would even say a revolution or an explosion in symbolic and ritual expression, or at least it looks that way in the archaeological record. Other people would say that's just because there's been a huge bias of research towards Europe, and that if we keep looking in South Asia and other parts of Africa, we're going to find exactly the same damn thing, which I think is inherently
that seems
likely.
Plausible, but it doesn't really matter where it happened. It matters that it happened all at once, and why it didn't happen for such a long time before.
Or why is it? Or also, it is a problem of visibility. Why is it so visible all of a sudden in the archaeological record of broadly Europe and Western Asia at that particular point in the Upper Paleolithic? And it's that problem of visibility of the evidence that we end up sort of focusing on, which brings us back to these points about seasonality, because one of the things that we learnt, I think, from the ethnography is that when Moos and Durkheim talk about seasonal variations, they're kind of interested in them from the vantage point of the sociologist. They expose something to the sociologist about the society you're observing. But what Loy and Clastres do is a bit more radical, because what they point out is that people are actually highly self-conscious about these changes in their social arrangements.
This is really important, because what happens in the ethnography is that point gets lost because it veers off in two directions. So you start from Moos, and then Durkheim takes it in keeps the seasonality, but he loses the self-consciousness, the idea that people are actually aware that they're moving back and forth between different social possibilities. So he has them sort of in this sort of effervescent haze where they see society coming on them and they don't understand it. Whereas then you have Lowy, he's all about how people are very conscious of the politics. And Clastres takes that up and says, no, people are consciously avoiding the emergence of certain forms of hierarchy of state power, proto-state power, anything that could turn into state power in the future, but he loses his seasonality because somehow it doesn't work in a way that best makes his case. So then you say, well, why are they self-conscious? And you can put the two together and it makes perfect sense. You know, you're self-conscious about political possibilities because you're actually moving back and forth between radically different social possibilities yourself every year. It's a regular occurrence. And even Lévi-Strauss, actually, in his ethnographic writings, which nobody reads, actually pointed that out, that you had this idea of the Nambikwara chief as being a kind of a modern political actor, because he's sitting there constantly thinking, well, you have this agricultural season when we're all together in a village, and then we go trekking, so you're trying to arrange things and mediate disputes and work the rituals in such a way that you can get like a lot of people who will want to be sticking with you when you go off and lead people off in these foraging expeditions where everybody disperses and you have a different social structure. But then when you're doing that, you're trying to impress them in such a way that when you go back to the village, so everybody's like sort of thinking about how their actions will affect each other in incredibly different contexts, and they're self-conscious of the fact that they're moving back and forth between different social possibilities. So the idea that these are sort of people lost in the mires of tradition is they're playing around with different ways of existing all the time.
So then the question is, what specific bearing does all this have on the Upper Paleolithic and on this sort of precocious evidence for social inequality? There can be little doubt that human beings living in the northern latitudes of the Pleistocene world would have experienced much sharper seasonal variations than their contemporaries in other parts of the world. But does the archaeological evidence actually support the idea that their social structures alternated in the kind of very plastic, flexible way that interests us about these ethnographic accounts? For example, through regular seasonal aggregation and dispersal, perhaps linked to the hunting of large herds of migratory game. So seasonal periods of not just abundance, but actually superabundance, followed by periods of relative scarcity. What I can't do right now is summarize the entire archaeological record of the Upper Paleolithic, but I can flick through it. That's not it.
No. But what about the masks?
The what?
The
masks.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later.
We'll come back to that.
15 minutes.
That's exactly what we need. Because there is France, where you have decades and decades and decades of work by archaeologists, particularly regional surveys, which demonstrate exactly this kind of seasonal flux. Again, it's this guy Randall White who's done the seminal work way back in the 1970s, where he actually ends up citing Marcel Mauss on the Inuit and saying it was a bit like this, because you have these regional aggregation sites, including some of those very famous painted caves in the Périgord and on the Dordogne, and the kind of pattern that's reconstructed for settlement and mobility by him and people like Meg Conkey is precisely that kind of one of seasonal aggregation and dispersal. Very similar for Spanish Cantabria, and famous cave sites like Altamira and Castillo have been interpreted for decades as seasonal aggregation points, and there's lots of nice evidence from animal remains, fish in particular, and mollusks and that sort of thing to back this up. And there's also work which links that kind of seasonal aggregation to this kind of ritual effusiveness that you see in the art. There is similar kind of work, and I particularly want to emphasize Olga Sofer's brilliant comprehensive analysis of the Upper Paleolithic of the central Russian plain, where she managed to do fieldwork based in Chicago even during the Cold War. I've never understood how she pulled that off, but anyway, she did it. This is the so-called Mammoth Steppe, where you have these really spectacular settlements like Mezin and Mezirich, with their mammoth bone dwellings and their abundance of portable art. And she shows that they're very suggestively aligned along the major river systems of the Dnieper and the Don, just like those French sites are very strategically placed at choke points along valleys, exactly where, if you were hunting a great herd of deer in that case, or mammoth, or bison in this case, exactly where you would want to put yourself to intercept them. And she shows exactly this kind of seasonal flux between winter base camps and summer hunting camps and so on. Very similar kind of reconstructions for the Pavlov Hills in southern Moravia, which are one of the richest areas of the Paleolithic record, sites like Dolny Vestonica, and a lot of them have these. I mean, this is pretty conclusive, really, because look at this. These are all dead mammoth. There's a big debate about whether this is the direct result of human hunting, or whether people basically waited around till all the mammoths got tired and cold and dropped dead and then descended on them. And that's a big debate in Paleolithic archaeology. It doesn't really matter from the point of view of our argument, because even if they all fell over and died by themselves, you've still got a big party and a lot of frozen meat in which to aggregate. Again, we are talking clearly here about important differences in social possibilities, which are linked to seasonal fluctuations in economic resources and opportunities to congregate. And actually the latest arguments about Göbekli Tepe are rather similar, because the latest work there, stable isotope analysis of gazelle remains, gazelle being the most frequently hunted herd animal on the Harran Plain, on the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, do actually link the establishment of the site to this seasonal flood of gazelle down into the plain. So what exactly are we arguing, and what exactly are we not arguing? We've got a few minutes to sum it up. I think what we are... 12, in fact. What we are emphatically not arguing is that these kind of seasonal variations actually cause changes in human capacities, whether that's social or cognitive capacities. We don't believe that seasonal variations had any kind of effect on the hardwiring of the brain or anything like that. That's not what we're claiming. What we are suggesting, drawing the lessons that we draw from that earlier anthropological ethnographic tradition, is that when you have strongly dualistic patterns of social organization, such as almost certainly would have existed on the glacial fringe in the Upper Paleolithic, you also have opportunities, particular kinds of opportunities, for that kind of conscious and reflexive elaboration of social structures, which reveals itself, we think, in the archaeological record as this apparent explosion of expressive activities, and in the use of symbolic resources to experiment with all kinds of different social arrangements, hierarchical, egalitarianism, different ways of expressing them materially. So what we're proposing is that the archaeological record of the last ice age in Europe is to the archaeologist a bit like the ethnographic record of the Inuit was to the anthropologist. It's a world of extremities, structured extremities, where these kind of elementary features of human social life, that might otherwise be rather invisible become visible to us as investigators. And then similarly with Göbekli Tepe, it seems that despite the monumentality of those stone temples, the latest evidence suggests that each of those buildings might actually have had a rather short lifespan, which ended with the complete filling in of the building with the remains of an enormous collective feast. So we may have hierarchies raised to the sky, only then to be swiftly torn down again. So if we bring this all back to the question that we started with, were our early ancestors simple and egalitarian, or were they complex and stratified? Well, maybe it's the question that's just wrong. Do we have to choose between Hobbes and Rousseau? Do we have to choose between an egalitarian and a hierarchical beginning to the human story? We don't think so. We think you just have to say goodbye to the state of nature or the childhood of man and acknowledge, as Levi-Strauss pointed out all the time, that the people we're talking about were not just behaviorally like us, but also intellectually like us, philosophically like us, not necessarily in their ideas, but in their capacities. They would have been aware of many later social possibilities. They played around with all of these paradoxes. And equally they fail to understand them, just as much as we often fail to understand why it is that our world is plunging into yet another phase of radical inequality, despite the best efforts of everyone to come up with alternatives. We think perhaps this is what being intellectually modern could actually mean. So if there's a riddle here, it would actually be why, after thousands of years of constructing and then deconstructing forms of hierarchy, why does our species, Homo sapiens, supposedly the cleverest and wisest of apes, give way and get stuck in much more permanent and intractable systems of social inequality? And that is the question we ended up with, and that we now want to try and answer.
Well, okay, that was such a good conclusion. I won't give one of my own. I'll just wait for the questions.
Okay.
Oh, all right. It's really interesting to look at this stuff from the perspective of anthropology and rituals. Because, that pattern of systematic back and forth kind of gets turned into a back and forth between moments of ritual. This is what Durkheim was getting at. He talked about a ritual season, and then there's a sort of ordinary, secular, non-sacred season. And the ritual season is a time of social creativity where new things can emerge, and suddenly people realize they're in society. But one of the paradoxes of this material is that it doesn't go both ways. You have these people dispersing into little bands, and they get together into little micro-cities, and they take it apart and go back and forth. But sometimes the little bands are really hierarchical, and the micro-cities are really egalitarian, and sometimes it's the other way around. There's no telling. Or sometimes they're both hierarchical, and sometimes neither of them are. So the point is that they're different. And it seems like insofar as there's a holdover from this, there's an idea that there's a kind of you pivot back and forth between a ritual time, which is a time of creativity where you can create new forms, and sort of ordinary life. But one of the great problems of ritual studies is exactly that. Are rituals basically about recreating hierarchy? So there's a whole school of ritual is just a really elaborate version of etiquette and formality, and it's all about expressing hierarchical deference or imagining a world of perfect order, which is different than the sort of chaotic world around us. There's a huge school of ritual studies that makes a very convincing case that that's what ritual is about, that social structure doesn't really exist in ordinary life there's a long tradition of British anthropology coming up with these beautiful models of social structure. There are 7 clans and they marry in a circle like this, and then they have a moiety structure. And, you can do all these maps and diagrams. Then you discover that, no village actually has a moiety. No village has all 7 clans. People really marry who they like, and half the time they break the rules. So where are these patterns? It's actually usually has to do with the seating at a ritual. So it's only at specific ritual moments that society and that structure actually occurs. So all those hierarchies seem to exist in the ritual moment, and then you disperse and do your thing, or you're pragmatic, as Durkheim would say. But sometimes it's exactly the opposite. sometimes you have the carnivalesque rituals where you live, as an incredibly hierarchical existence most of the year, and then you get together and have a huge party and like turn the world upside down and invert all hierarchies, and actual peasant revolts usually begin during carnivals or Christmas because people kind of like that and want to keep it that way. So which is it? Is ritual subversive, or is it anti-subversive? You can't tell. It's very much like the moving back and forth between seasons, which could mean either of them. And in a way, what makes us humans in that modern sense is not that we're ritual, not that we're pragmatic, but that we move back and forth between the two. That's what creates self-conscious beings, aware of different social possibilities. And when we say that, free will to the childhood of man, we still have this idea that at some point people were just naive and lost in kind of habitus. They couldn't possibly imagine another way of existence. Nature and society was the same thing. And gradually we worked our way into this self-consciousness of our possibilities. And what we're suggesting is no, actually this goes back as far as you can go. People used to be more able to play around with social possibilities in the past than we are now. Somehow we got stuck in a hierarchical rut, they used to set the thing up and rip it down and set it up and rip it down. And one day they didn't rip it down and they forgot they could rip it down, and here we are,
Built it in stone.
Yeah. So I guess the idea is how we get back to that cycle again.
Well, thanks for throwing a big spanner into the works.